Welcome to the first presentation in the 16th straight year of the Town History Series. Started back in 2005. It's interesting to me from a Arousik perspective that the first presentation in 2005 was by an Arousik person who had lived, by then was living in Bath, Roy Lawrence. We'll hear a little bit more about Roy in today's presentation. When I set up that very first one, I thought, well, we might get 10 or 15 people, so I was going to do it in the history room. And then it was Roy Lawrence, so everybody came. And luckily, nobody was in this room, so I brought the 60 of them into here and reserved it for the rest of, actually for the rest of 16 years. Before we get any further, I wanted to mention Millie Stafford, who, when you speak of Arousik history, she was the Arousik historian for decades at least, yeah. And she was very active in the Arousik Fire Department and took minutes and recorded all the events that came out of that, to the point that the latest, I don't know whether it's an engine or what kind of pumper is dedicated to her and has her name on the door. She was quite a lady. I invited her to participate in the very first Town History Series. She said at that time she didn't have a particular story she wanted to tell, but she did attend sessions, was active in every way historically. Some of her items we have in the history room. Others, I think, still need to be dug out and put somewhere. Hopefully people will be working on it, because she had a big storage of historic items related to Arousik. And many of us who gave presentations used illustrations from her and other items.
Peter,
yeah.
Can I just correct, when we did the dedication to the fire truck, Millie actually said that the volunteer fire department was started by the women of Arousik during World War II. And that she was not the secretary, she was there making sure she kept them in line.
There's a great article that Millie basically wrote with two other people in, I think, the February 16 or 17 Arousik Arrow, which you can get on the town website, about the whole story of the fire department, her participation. It's really worth reading.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get started today. I did want to mention that the whole series is co-sponsored by the library and Bath Historical. We have the president of Bath Historical, Nathan Lipford, here, and we have the director of the library, Leslie Dollinger, in the back. Our financial sponsor, once again, is Raymond James through the White Mountain Wealth Management in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And once again, Richard Wenzel has agreed to film the series and then distribute copies, not just back to us that you can check out, but to all the local TV stations. So thank you, Richard, for doing that. Now, before we start, I want to make sure you turn off your cell phones. We're going to save all questions and discussion till after Matt's talk. And everyone cough in unison. So I probably have forgotten something, but let's get started. Here's Matt Caras, who's going to talk about Arrowsic's Intertidal Zone. Take it away, Matt.
Thanks, Pete. There are some seats over here if you want to work your way around. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You know, the great thing about history is that it's a story. And today, our story begins 13 to 16,000 years ago when the first people migrated to the Americas from Asia. The widely held view for most of the 20th century was that these people traveled by land across the Bering Strait, which was exposed at the time, and then dispersed south through North America and South America. Over the past couple of decades, a new theory has emerged, and this new theory states that these people took a more linear route, hugging the coast of the Pacific Northwest, traveling through the intertidal zone and on what is known as the Kelp Highway. Unlike the East Coast, apparently the coast of the Pacific Northwest is literally blanketed in kelp, and it provided a rich environment, a rich habitat for wildlife, which provided an abundant source of food for people migrating from Asia to the Americas. This theory states that these people, at one of the first opportunities they had to move inland, did so, which was probably the Columbia River in present-day Oregon. Others continued to hug the coastline on the Kelp Highway farther south and then moved inland. And of course, over time, relatively quickly, in the scheme of things, South America was populated. What is currently the United States, including the West Coast, was populated by these indigenous people. Indigenous people not because they originated here, but because they were the first people here. There is evidence of these indigenous people on Arrowsic Island as far back as 7,000 years ago. What is Arousic's intertidal zone? It's pretty simple. It's the land between the high and low water marks. Because Arousik is an island bordered by 3 tidal rivers, 100% of our border has an intertidal zone. The west shore, of course, the Kennebec River, the northeastern shore, the Sasanoa River, and the southeastern shore, the Back River. The Back and the Sasanoa flowing to and from the Kennebec. Arowsic's intertidal zone is diverse. It consists of rock, mud, sand, marsh, cordgrass, and of course rockweed, which exists virtually everywhere in Arowsic's intertidal zone. This is a photo taken from the western side of Crow Island, looking across at Bald Head at the southern tip of Arowsic Island, and you can see the expansive flats. The intertidal zone consists of varying degrees of slope. In some cases, it's literally vertical, exposes no tidal flat. In other places, it extends horizontally over hundreds of feet of exposed tidal flat at low tide. This again looking west toward Bald Head on one of the larger tidal flats in Arowsic's intertidal zone. We have a relatively large tidal range here. It can be on any given day as much as 12 feet, typically occurring at a new and a full moon. That's relatively speaking, a large tidal range. As you move east down the Maine coast to Bar Harbor and then up to the Bay of Fundy, there are some of the largest tidal ranges in the world. I understand that in the Bay of Fundy, the tidal range can be as much as 30 feet. Why is the tidal range significant? It's significant because as the tide drops, you have large volumes of water passing through tight and narrow guts and around obstructions, creating tidal currents. And our intertidal zone is characterized by very strong tidally driven currents. This again, the southern tip of Arowsic Island. You see Crow Island in the lower right. At low tide, you see the flat extending from Bald Head to Crow Island. Up here at high tide, that is on the far left of the screen, that is Crow Island at a higher tide, and the flat has disappeared. What inhabits Arousic's intertidal zone? I mean, there are hundreds of species that inhabit, I suspect probably thousands of species that inhabit our intertidal zone. Some not visible to the naked eye. I included a couple of the common sites in our intertidal zone. A striped bass, which is a frequent visitor. This photo taken in our intertidal zone. In the lower right, a couple of river otters scampering across the upland edge of Arousic's intertidal zone. Common site of a great blue heron, of course our bloodworm, and our friend the green crab. But there are just hundreds of species that inhabit our intertidal zone. As I said, our intertidal zone is characterized by swift currents, tidally driven currents. The passage known as Upper Hell Gate on the northeastern part of the island is one of the currents most well known on the Maine coast. And it has been for hundreds of years. It's interesting to note that when Champlain circumnavigated Arousik in 1605, and he was a prolific writer, and so his journals note landmarks that are known to us all. He described them by different names, but they're easy to recognize. When he approached Hell Gate, he was moving on an incoming tide, and he noted that as he traveled in his 40-foot patache, that he moved very easily with the tide, on the incoming tide. But when he approached this passage known as Upper Hell Gate today, the current came against him forcefully. He needed the assistance of Native Americans to pull him through the gut with lines. And then he noted once through, he again moved easily with the incoming tide. It's a phenomenon that anyone who has boated through the passage has seen. Champlain even called it a waterfall, and it may have been more like a waterfall at the time. It was clearly more intimidating at the time, because in 1898, the Army Corps of Engineers came in and not only moved obstructions within the passage, but also widened this passage to a minimum of 90 feet. And then within the next 10 years, came back and widened it to a minimum of 140 feet. It's a heavily traveled route, and to make this inland waterway from the Kennebec to points east and north more navigable. But so when Champlain came through here, it could have been 50 or 60 feet wide, and of course that means on a tide, as the tide drops, it's just that much stronger a current. What might you have seen in Arowsic's intertidal zone, say 1400, the significant point about the date meaning before the European presence? You would have seen Wabanaki on the flats gathering shellfish, probably on a seasonal basis. You can see on the left the oysters, which were probably abundant at the time, and then our beloved soft-shell clam also would have been abundant. You probably would have seen Wabanaki building or using fish weirs. Fish weirs are a kind of a crude type of net, or more aptly a cage for fishing. And the way these things worked was they were set up and they had a kind of a funneling opening at one end, and usually at the end where the tidal current would flow into the cage, and humans would literally in knee-deep or waist-deep water help corral fish as they came down with the tide into the cage, and then would catch them. Extremely effective where there are tidal currents, and therefore extremely effective in the intertidal zone, and probably many places around our island. There is evidence in the Georgetown historical records that the Wabanaki had fish weirs again down in the Crow Island area at the southern tip of Arousik. What might you have seen in Arousic's intertidal zone in the mid-1600s? Take just a step back for a second. We know that in the 16th century, the Europeans were frequently sailing the coast of Maine. The first English presence was George Weymouth in 1605, the summer of 1605. When he sailed up the Kennebec, would have observed the western shore of Arrowsic Island. There is no evidence that he sailed the back river or the Sassanoa. He left, took word back to England about the potential to settle here, the potential to trade, the abundance of fur, the abundance of fish. Literally 9 days after Weymouth left the mouth of the Kennebec, Champlain arrived in July of 1605 under the French flag, and he did, as I mentioned earlier, in his exploration, circumnavigate the island of Arousik. He had attempted a settlement the year before on St. Croix Island, with the present-day border of Maine and Canada. It failed in a year. The English came back in 1607 and attempted a permanent settlement at Popham. That, of course, failed also in a year. And for the next 40 years or so, there were not any serious attempts to create significant permanent settlements in this area that at the time was generally known as Sagadahoc. There were a lot of people, a lot of Europeans present in the area, but principally small-scale commercial activity, fishing, trading, trapping, hunting. We know that John Weber established a small site on present-day Squirrel Point in 1616, and he fished the area for years. In 1630, John Parker established a small site at Squirrel Point as well, and he's a well-known figure in the history of Arousik and Georgetown. But it was an active area. There was a lot of coming and going, and the English were throughout the Kennebec region. An observer in 1648 noted that on any given day, if you traveled between Cape Ann on the north shore of Boston to Monhegan Island, you might see as many as 400 fishing boats in the water, and most of them after cod, which was the prized fish in England. The first significant settlement in the area was on Arousik Island, and it was the settlement established by Thomas Clark and Thomas Lake in 1657. Clark and Lake were Bostonians of English heritage who in the early part of the century had established significant commercial activities in Boston, had generated considerable wealth, according to comments in the Massachusetts legislative history. They were each among the 1% wealthiest people in the Boston area at the time. Their activities were profitable. They saw an opportunity to expand north in the Mass Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony, and came into the Kennebec region and actually started buying up land in the area, in the areas surrounding Arousik. They were purchasing it as opposed to simply squatting the way many had done before them. So they were purchasing land from the Native American Indians in some instances, and other instances from Englishmen who had purchased it from the Native American Indians. But beginning in the late 1650s, they acquired land on Arousik Island, and as I understand it, owned all but a few acres on the island by the time they were done buying it. Clark and Lake chose the site known as Spring Cove on the Sassanoa River in the northeastern shore of the Sassanoa River. on Arousik Island for several reasons. One is that there was, and I think still is, an abundance of fresh water critical to a settlement, because this route was a very heavily traveled route, so it was a good trade route. It was heavily traveled at the time, just as it is today. They chose it because of its strong tidal currents, and they leveraged those currents, not just to survive, not just for the self-sufficiency of their settlement, but also to profit in trade. And also is interesting, there's a contemporaneous note, that Clark and Lake had a tremendous advantage because they referenced a creek on the island of Arrowsic where there was an abundance of shad and alewife, which was the best bait for the spring cod fishing, and cod was the prized fish. Which creek they were referring to, I don't know, but it was on the island. So a good site for a settlement. They quickly built a significant settlement. By all accounts, it was the most significant settlement north of what is today the border of New Hampshire and Maine. They had several structures, had a fort, had a residential building called the Mansion House. There are references to Palace Cove getting its name because people viewed this mansion house as a palace. They had blacksmith shops, coppersmith shops, structures on the land. And they had a booming business, and they did it all leveraging the intertidal zone. How did they do that? They did it. They obviously fished the flats for shellfish and finfish. They harvested the salt hay to feed their livestock. They used the tide to power grist mills to produce grain, not just for themselves, but to trade. And they leveraged the tide with sawmills. They had more than one sawmill on the island, the first of which appears to have been, and you can see the diagram of Spring Cove looking across to the south, looking across Palace Cove to Mill Island, right here. And according to Emerson Baker, their first sawmill was on Mill Island, and it was a tidal powered sawmill. In addition, they had a shipyard, so they used the sawmill to produce boards, not just for their own structures, but to build ships, and they sold boards. Contemporaneous account referenced as many as 100,000 board feet ready for transport from the Clark and Lake settlement. So when you start digging, it was a remarkable achievement, a remarkable accomplishment, and as I've said here, they leveraged our intertidal zone for food, power, and building materials, and they were self-sufficient, and they made a ton of money in the process. Unfortunately, their endeavor came to an abrupt halt in 1676. There was an Indian attack on the fort, and people were either killed or they fled. Thomas Lake was in residence at the time. As I understand it, Clark and Lake alternated years in residence, one in Boston, one in Arousik. Lake had the lack of fortune to have been here during the attack. He got off the island, made his way over to Flying Point, but was captured quickly after he landed. Into the 18th century, Arousik, the island continued to be the most prominent place on the mid-coast of Maine, socially, economically, and politically. The island was incorporated as a town in 1716 called Georgetown on Arousik. The on Arousik referencing, of course, the center of the town, the Georgetown being a complement to King George. The area known as Georgetown on Arousik expanded quickly in the early part of the 18th century. most of the commerce was water dependent in the 17th and 18th centuries. It depended on sawmills, grist mills, fishing, hunting, haying, and of course, in order to have water-dependent activities, you need structures in the intertidal zone. In essence, the bridge between land and navigable water, and they were a necessity. The Crown had an interest in commerce in the Mass Bay Colony, including our area in Arousik, and really twofold. One, to generate profitable activities, but also to further lay stake to the area as a British area. There was legislation passed in 1641 and further developed to 1647 that had a profound impact on not only commercial activity on Arousik Island, but in the entire region. The British thought that they needed a little more order in the colony, and developed a document that had rules and was going to govern the colony. And it included a very interesting provision, which is today generally referred to as the Colonial Ordinance, that regulated the intertidal zone. And it regulated the intertidal zone for the purpose of stimulating commercial activity and in giving landowners comfort in building structures and investing in the intertidal zone to stimulate their business activity. In what the Colonial Ordinance said, I will say that at the time, this area was governed by British common law, and British common law said that the intertidal zone, the land between the high and low water marks, was owned by the Crown, or the state, if you will. The Colonial Ordinance changed the British common law in the Mass Bay Colony, and provided that and granted ownership of the intertidal zone, the land between the high and the low water mark, to the landowner, the contiguous landowner. So if you owned shoreline by the Colonial Ordinance, you acquired ownership of the intertidal zone contiguous to a land. It had a profound impact. It gave landowners comfort to expand and invest in the intertidal zone for their activities. The Colonial Ordinance said that the shoreland owner owned the intertidal zone subject to the right of the public to engage in 3 activities: fishing, fowling, and navigation. In other words, the public had the right to fish in the intertidal zone, had the right to hunt for birds in the intertidal zone, and the property owner could not impede navigation in the intertidal zone. The one caveat being that the public cannot trespass to gain access to the intertidal zone. This is the actual text of the Colonial Ordinance, and you can see it says it is declared that all creeks, coves, and other places about and upon salt water where the sea ebbs and flows, the proprietor of the land adjoining shall have property to the low water mark, subject up above to the right of the public to engage in fishing and fowling, and down below the property owner shall not by this liberty have power to stop or hinder the passage of boats. So it was a very important development in this region and on Arousik Island. The courts construing the Colonial Ordinance since the time it was enacted have repeatedly confirmed that the purpose was to encourage the construction of wharfs and other structures within the intertidal zone. As they said up top, wharfing out became a safe activity. And the courts, I picked a couple of opinions in 1822, the court said the desire and necessity of wharfs and the occupation of flats became indispensable. The government then, to encourage these objects and to prevent disputes and litigations, transferred its property to the proprietor of the land adjoining the low water mark. So it's pretty clear what the purpose of the colonial ordinance was, and the courts have repeated it over and over again. There has, and it was necessary, as is the case with most laws, the court has spent a lot of time interpreting these terms, fishing and fouling and navigation, to try to make it clear what is permitted and what isn't permitted from the public's point of view. Navigation is relatively simple. There has not been much litigation. Fouling is relatively simple too. The area that has required the greatest interpretation is this word fishing. The courts, including our highest court in Maine, and this ordinance applies in present-day Massachusetts and Maine, and it is a minority view in this country. The courts have repeatedly construed these three terms very narrowly and literally. I have included a couple of significant opinions over the years. 1884, fishing does not include the right to erect fish weirs. It makes sense. That would be like building a structure on someone's land. You can't do it in the intertidal zone either. 1952, fishing does include the right to dig worms, bloodworms, sandworms. The area that has been litigated the most, however, is what else is the public permitted to do in the intertidal zone? And the argument has been made that in more modern times, there should be additional uses permitted. Our court in Maine has made it clear, though, over and over again, in the case that's kind of viewed as the landmark case in this regard, the Town of Wells case in 1989, the court made it absolutely clear the public does not have the right to use the intertidal zone for general recreational uses such as strolling along the beach, sunbathing, picnicking, and those types of things. In other words, the colonial ordinance will be narrowly and strictly interpreted. This will continue as over the years. In this past year, in 2019, a very interesting case, again involving the term fishing. The harvesting of rockweed is an industry that has grown over the last couple of decades in Maine. Harvesters like this gentleman go out through the intertidal zone and harvest rockweed and sell it for food and, fertilizer and other things. A landowner wanted the court to determine whether the harvesting of rockweed is fishing within the meaning of the colonial ordinance. In other words, can someone do it in the intertidal zone which they own under the colonial ordinance? The court, our highest court, said harvesting rockweed is not fishing, and that rockweed in the intertidal zone is property of the shoreline owner. And the sort of the analogy that was made is harvesting rockweed is tantamount to walking up on the upland edge and cutting down a tree. In other words, rockweed is not like a fish that comes and goes, or other types of of animals that do so. So this will continue as uses of the intertidal zone continue. There will continue to be cases, but the court has literally construed the colonial ordinance. In part due to this ordinance, the commerce flourished in Arousik in the 18th and 19th centuries. Shipbuilding continued. Emerson Baker claims that Clark and Lake in their shipyard on Arousik Island built 12 ships. Baker says that between 1750 and 1900, 22 ships were built in Arousik, and that they were as large as 100 feet in length. There's a list compiled by Baker of vessels built in Arousik. And sawmills flourished in Arousik. There were significant sawmills at this time on the western shore of Arousik Island. Here's a shot of the spinning mill, and you can actually see, looking north, the spinning mill is just south of Doubling Point, but you can see, I believe, in the background looking north, I believe that's the range lights and Coast Guard structure. I don't know for certain, but it puts in perspective where this photo was taken. And then, of course, the Crosby Mill on Mill Island. These mills flourished, these two in particular, from the early 1800s into the early 20th century. Arouse's first tidal powered sawmill was the Clark and Lake Sawmill on Mill Island in the 1650s. The map shows the proximity between Spring Cove, the Clark and Lake settlement, and Mill Island, with Palace Cove in between. This is an aerial view of Mill Island, and I included it because you can see the dramatic change between the high tide view of Mill Island, and that's the site where the Crosby Mill was located, and the low tide location of the mill. They're different angles. Obviously, you're looking across the island at low tide, but I like the shot because you can see the extensive tidal flat. You can compare it to high tide, and you know when that tide drops, a tremendous amount of water moves through the area, and it was harnessed to power the sawmill. This picture, just to put this in perspective, that's the back river, the very narrow channel that exists at low tide heading into the back river. The picture, I wasn't able to date this photo, but I suspect this was in the 1930s when the mill was still operating. This is the Crosby Mill on the southeastern side of Arousik Island. Another view, here you can see the mill structures up here. You can see the earthen dam that in essence connected Mill Island to the point, the current Nature Conservancy land. The idea being was that there was a dam created so that the water could be harnessed through gates to power the sawmill. In 2008, an Arousik resident sat down with Roy Lawrence, mentioned by Pete earlier today, when Roy was 96 years old. He apparently grew up in Arousik, lived on a house that was built from lumber sawn at the Crosby Mill. His father worked at the mill from 1910 to 1930. This is a very detailed account of the mill and how it operated. It's a fascinating read. There is a copy of this in the history room, but he describes in detail the way the mill worked, and this would have been in the early part of the 20th century. He described in detail in diagram, you can see here the dam and the tidal gates. Those gates, when the tide was high and beginning to drop, those gates would open and the water would flow through, propel a wheel which drove a shaft which powered the saw. I did a little insert here. I found it interesting. He noted that in the dam, he says part of the earthen dam revealed the wooden remains of an old spillway from previous activities at the site. We know that there was probably a mill here, perhaps continuously from the early 1800s until the late 1930s. Another diagram from Roy. He said he returned in 1965 and the remains of the mill were still standing on Mill Island. I found in an old file this painting. This may have been what the remains looked like when Roy returned in 1965. I've not been able to identify the artist, but this may have been what Roy saw in 1965. There may be others, maybe even in this room, who saw that site. The spinning mill closed in the late 1930s, as did the Crosby Mill. In the latter part of the 20th century, the focus of regulation of the intertidal zone shifted dramatically. For years and years, the focus of regulation was to encourage commercial activity in the intertidal zone. It was in the interest of the public and individuals to do so. In the second half of the 20th century, focus shifted to the protection of the intertidal zone as a critical resource, both for the benefit of the wildlife that uses that habitat, but also for human beings. In 1979, Arrowsic adopted its first shoreland ordinance, and it provided a guideline on development in the intertidal zone and on the contiguous shoreland. In the mid-1980s, Arrowsic adopted a comprehensive plan, and it had as a principal objective to preserve and protect. It had language that I pulled out that said by providing resource protection districts around critical shores and around significant wetlands, by limiting development and vegetation removal, and by continuing to extend shoreline protection to tidal wetlands. So you can see the shift in focus, and this occurred not just in Arrowsic, this occurred throughout Maine, and in fact there was a state mandate for towns to comply and enact their own ordinances. In 2010, Arrowsic adopted its first shoreland zoning map, which you see on the right, and I thought it was appropriate to use throughout this presentation. In Arrowsic, the shoreland zone, which is the area that is upland 250 feet from the high water mark, is broken down into three districts: special protection, resource protection, and shoreland district, each with a different set of guidelines on what is permitted within the particular district based on the nature of the habitat, the nature of the shoreline. And so you can see the map shows in red and yellow and green the three different districts. But regulation came from everywhere. It was local, it was state, it was federal at this time. I used as an example the 2007 the Natural Resource Protection Act was expanded. There was updated mapping of shorebird habitat in the area, including in Arrowsic, and this designated critical feeding and roosting habitat on the coastline. Feeding, of course, being where shorebirds feed, roosting being where shorebirds spend their time when the tide is high and the intertidal zone is not free for feeding. And it's interesting to show the progression. And a bit counterintuitive. The greatest protections, for example, in the bird habitat mapping, is not for our year-round residents. It's not for gulls and herons and Canada geese, or our seasonal residents. It's for migrating birds, birds that may be migrating from the Arctic to South America, and they, for example, will stop maybe for a week, 10 days on the island of Arrowsic in a particular area that is conducive to feeding and roosting. And the reason the greatest protections are provided to this type of species is that when they are here for a week, they need to consume X number of calories per day to generate the energy to be able to make the balance of their migration. And so when they head south from Maine, to South America, they're flying over the Atlantic, and if they don't get the calories they need when they're visiting us for a week, they don't make it. They go into the sea, or so weak when they land that they die. And so these maps are intended to protect the areas where the birds need to feed. If these areas are disrupted, they are unable to consume the calories they need to make their migration. This is the soil, this is the level and the shift. This is a good example of the shift in the focus of the regulation of the intertidal zone. Arouse emphasizes education, has published a really well done stewardship guide, which talks about the ways that we can all care for our land and water, including the shoreland zone. There has been, and for years has been, an emphasis on conservation. I mentioned earlier the new Nature Conservancy tract on the eastern shore of Arouse. So what are the commercial uses of Arousic's intertidal zone today? There aren't many. The wormers continue to prosper in Arousic's intertidal zone. It's a decent-sized industry in the state of Maine. It's not like the lobster industry or the shellfish industry, but the wormers, and these are principally bloodworms, not sandworms, do well. I understand these little guys that the wormers sell them from between 25 and 50 cents a piece, depending on their size. The area, the Sassanou and the Kennebec and the back rivers are well known for the striped bass fishing, which is our principal recreational sport fish. In the good years, the Kennebec is mentioned in the same sentence with the great striped bass fishing areas like Chatham and Cape Cod, and Montauk off the tip of Long Island, and the Chesapeake, which is, of course, where our striped bass migrate from each spring and then return to the Chesapeake in the fall. When they're here in the summer, in good years, the guides do well. In some years, have an outfitted trip literally every day during the spring and summer and fall. Here on the right, you see a guide with some happy campers who have achieved a triple hookup here of striped bass. There is no commercial striped bass fishing in Maine to preserve the resource, unlike some of our neighbors to the south, but the recreational striped bass fishing is a big industry for Maine. Probably far more profitable for the state than a commercial industry ever could be. But today, the predominant use of the intertidal zone is recreation. It's boating, it's docks, it's fishing, it's swimming. And I included this slide because there's a misperception that the biggest fish are in the deep channels in the Kennebec, and that you catch them with live bait like eels fishing on the bottom. But it is a misperception, and I included this photo over on the left. You can see a crab trap, part of the green crab trapping study in the water, and you can see it's about a foot deep in water. And this bass, which is a pretty good sized bass, was caught on the fly right in this area in a foot of water. The bass roam the intertidal zone. The feeding for them is simple. The bait fish gets caught in the tide, almost paralyzed, can't fight it, and the bass just pick off the bait very easily. When the tide comes in, they're able to pick up stuff that's been on the flat. When it's coming out, they just feed as the bait comes right out with the tide. So you'll see, it's common to sight fish in the intertidal zone, which means you look for the wake of the bass, which you can see when they're in a foot of water, and you, much like a quarterback would lead a receiver, you cast your fly out ahead of the fish and hope you hit the right spot. This is the intertidal zone in Hockomock Bay. I included this picture because Our intertidal zone is brackish, and there are species that most associate with inland ponds and lakes. This is a picture of a white perch. Some of the biggest white perch I have ever seen I've caught in Arrousic's intertidal zone, and it's a fish that most associate with lakes and ponds. No discussion of Arrousic's intertidal zone is really complete without a mention of rising sea level. This is a photo that Mike Prindler took of the northern section of Route 127 up heading toward Preble Point, actually coming from Preble Point. This is not a common sight, but it's also not uncommon. It's pretty hard to dispute that the sea level will not continue to rise for a while, and it will affect areas like Arrowsic, which of course is bordered by 3 tidal rivers. How will it affect us? Shoreline erosion, increasing floodplains, salt moving inland, potentially contaminating wells, and of course damage to roads, houses, utilities, and docks. So it will be a challenge for all, and planning will be necessary. And I included this photo because probably above all else, Arrousic's intertidal zone is beautiful. Its natural beauty is unparalleled. Here is the moon, and the pink sky reflecting off the flats and the shallow water. Do we have time for questions?